Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at the 13 schools of ancient Greek philosophy. Now, many schools of philosophy rose to prominence in ancient Greece. They espoused a range of philosophical positions, styles, and methods. Many of the words that we use today to describe similar positions or ideas were drawn originally from the names of these schools. Words like atom, cynic, skeptic, academic, and stoic all find their roots in the ancient philosophical schools of this time. Some of them were very clearly defined schools that gave lectures and lessons in particular locations, while others were loosely defined movements that maybe even weren't bound together by a single philosophy. In this video, we're going to cover the 13 most famous schools in ancient Greece. If someone is talking about an ancient Greek school of philosophy, we're probably going to cover it in this video, including 4 pre-Socratic schools, 4 Socratic schools, and of course the 3 major Hellenistic schools of ancient Greek philosophy. We have longer videos on many of these positions, and we'll include in a playlist on ancient philosophical schools, both this video but all of those other videos if you want a more in-depth take. This video is just going to serve as kind of a quick overview and introduction of the major schools of ancient Greek philosophy. So with that, let's get started. Now, first, we should start with the pre-Socratics. You can tell that someone was important in the history of a discipline when you divide your discipline into before Socrates and after Socrates. The term school is loosely applied to pre-Socratics because these were often small groups of philosophers following a common doctrine instead of the kind of more formal schools that we would see later. Now, the origins of philosophy are often traced to Thales of Miletus, who attempted to find natural explanations for various phenomena in place of the ubiquitous at the time religious explanations for phenomena. The Milesians looked for generalizable rules that explained what they saw in the world. This attempt to find generalized rules that could be used to predict future behavior, instead of attributing phenomena to the unpredictable wills and whims of the gods, was what set apart the Milesian school, and arguably started the project of philosophy. Thales, of course, was famous for being one of the first people to ever be able to predict an eclipse. Other members of this school included Anaximander and Anaximenes. Check out our video on Thales of Miletus for more on Thales and this school. Next up, we have the Pythagoreans. So, another pre-Socratic school of philosophy was Pythagoreanism. While you may associate Pythagoras most commonly with the Pythagorean theorem, Pythagoras was a bit of a mythic figure, in fact, in philosophy, who forbade the eating of beans and received philosophy through revelation. Remembering that in the pre-Socratic times, the lines between philosophy and religion were still quite blurred. However, later Pythagoreans, such as Philoleus, had much more philosophical views about the world, such as the claim that the world could be divided into things that were unlimited substances and things that we use to limit those substances, like shapes. And according to Philoleus, we could use mathematics to show us the correct harmonies in order to combine those two and find the right way to do it, such as we might do in music. Pythagoreanism was revived later as Neo-Pythagoreanism, but check out our video on Pythagoreanism for more on these positions. Next up, we have the Eleatics, who after Pythagoras have one of the most famous pre-Socratic philosophers, at least for the non-philosopher out there. Now, Parmenides was the leader of the Eleatics and began to drive philosophy more towards the use of deductive logic as a means for ascertaining truth, as opposed to simply observing natural phenomena in the world. Attempting to prove universal facts about reality, such as the claim that the universe is one with logic. A big debate in this period of time was whether the universe was one or the universe was many. The most famous student of Parmenides was Zeno, who is still recognized today for his paradoxes, which he used to defend the Eleatic claim that reality was one because things like plurality and things like movement are impossible. Melesius, another student of Parmenides, argued instead that reality is infinite, and empty space is impossible. Once again, butting up against, as we will see, the atomist notions of a world where all that exists is many different atoms and the void. Check out our videos on Zeno's paradoxes for more on the Eleatics. Now, as we said, the Eleatics, who thought the universe was one, butted up against the Atomists. Now, Atomists is less a school in ancient Greek philosophy and more of a position which was shared by philosophers from many different schools, such as the Epicureans, who would later hold this position. However, it started as a pre-Socratic viewpoint that was held by Democritus and his student Lysippus. This viewpoint claimed that the world was comprised of only atoms, indivisible tiny particles, and the void. All substances could be explained by the shape, arrangement, and position of these particles. In some ways, this school represented a counterpoint to the Eleatics' paradoxes about infinitely divisible distances, since atoms themselves were not divisible, and so could solve some of Zeno's paradoxes. The next quote-unquote school we're going to cover is the Sophist movement, which spans kind of the pre-Socratic period and the time of Plato and Aristotle. While some classify Sophists as a school, this is likely a misnomer. Rather, they were individuals who provided higher education in argumentation and oratory, but also pre-Socratic study of the natural world and the way to live a good life. They were traveling salesmen of education in some ways. Protagoras is a prime example of the Sophists. Particular views of Sophists are often challenging to discern, as many of their works have been lost. They often espouse different views because they weren't necessarily united by a single unifying position, and our main source for the Sophists is Plato, who is a very hostile source to Sophism. Plato really defined his Socratic philosophy against the foil of perhaps a bit of a straw man of Sophism. His portrayal of Sophists as being concerned only with persuasion, not truth, is one of the reasons for the negative connotation of our modern word sophistry. So with that, we're going to shift into some of the Socratic schools. There are other pre-Socratic thinkers that we haven't covered, but those cover the majority of the big schools that they might be fit under. Now, generally we think of Plato and his academy as the successor to Socrates. But Socrates had many other students who started their own schools and traditions, each claiming to be the rightful heir to Socratic philosophy. And these kind of Socratic schools had substantial influence on the later major Hellenistic schools, as we will see, and in some ways were proto-forms of some of those schools. This next group of 4 schools is often collectively identified as the Socratic schools, due to their founders' connection to Socrates. One school that was Socratic was founded by Aristippus of Cyrene, a student of Socrates, and continued by his daughter Arete and grandson Aristippus the Younger. The Cyrenaics were pure hedonists who not only claimed that pleasure was the only good, but as the Epicureans did, but argued that pleasure was not the absence of pain, which is what the Epicureans claimed, but that positive pleasure experienced through drinking, eating, and sex should be the goal of life. Other Cyrenaics included Hegesias, the death persuader, who convinced his students that life was not worth living, Anaxagoras, and Theodorus the atheist. The Cyrenaics have clear links to the Epicureans, who had a more nuanced view of pleasure, but still found pleasure to be the only good. Check out our video on Cyrenaicism for more. Another school which can claim lineage to Socrates was the tradition of Cynicism, through Antisthenes, though Diogenes of Sinope is most commonly identified with Cynicism. Cynics argued for following nature, claiming that artificial values created by these societies and cities we were creating of wealth, reputation, duties to family, and inhibitions were unnatural and led to the 3 causes of human misery: indulgence, desire, and ignorance. Cynics advocated more of a return to nature. They criticized in many ways, challenging both dialectically and in practice what society did and society as a concept. They covered all range of beliefs and societal conventions that they had issues with, while arguing for the self-sufficiency of an animal and the freedom of a god from the limits of society. The term cynic literally means canine or dog-like, referring both to the cynic propensity for living outside — Diogenes famously lived in a tub — like an animal, and the Cynic value of valuing animal characteristics over human ones. Other notable Cynics include Crates, Menippus, and Cyricidus. The Cynic rejection of artificial values was in some ways a precursor to the Stoic rejection of goods other than virtue. While the Stoics and the Cynics certainly had different positions, there we can see some of the linkages and lineages here from the Cynic rejection of kind of these artificial or fake values to what the Stoics are talking about when they're saying we shouldn't be accepting any goods other than virtue. All of these artificial goods or these artificial pleasures are bad. We should only be accepting goodness or virtue, as we'll see in a second. Next up, we have the Megarians. The Megarians or the Megarics were followers of Euclides, a student of Socrates. Now, there's a debate as to whether the Eristic school and the Dialectic school were simply later names for the Magarian school, or if these were actually splinter groups that separated off. Euclides married Socratic views on ethics with Eleatic views on logic and monism. This Eleatic heritage can be seen in later Megarians, like Eubulides, who is credited with inventing the famous liar paradox and the paradox of the heap, two of the major paradoxes to come out of antiquity, along with some of the paradoxes that were put forward by the Eleatics, such as Zeno's paradox. Diodorus Chronos and Philo the dialectician created modal logic systems, most famously Diodorus's master argument for fatalism, that only what actually occurs is possible. Check out our video on the 4 paradoxes of Eubulides for a little bit more on the Megarians, though hopefully we'll do a longer video on them soon. The final quote-unquote Socratic school that we'll look at is the Elean or Eretrian school, founded in Elis by Phaedo of Elis and later moved to Eretria, the Greek city, not the country, by Menedemus. Unfortunately, very little information about Phaedo's views or the views of this school survive. We have evidence that Phaedo was a student of Socrates, and one of Plato's dialogues is named for him. However, there's no evidence that the views espoused in Plato's dialogue really represent those of the real Phaedo. So unfortunately, we know very little about this school and what it said, which, when you get back into antiquity, there's always going to be a certain level of we don't really know. Before moving on to the 3 major Hellenistic schools of philosophy, we should mention the Peripatetics. The Peripatetic School was the school founded by Aristotle in the Peripatos, or covered walking area of the Lyceum. Despite the common confusion, it's unlikely that Aristotle's Peripatetics taught while walking around. Rather, Theophrastus took over the Lyceum in the final year of Aristotle's life and built on the scientific and empirical elements of Aristotle's philosophy. His successor, Strato, added to this, focusing the school on more of a materialistic empiricism in line with some of the more scientific teachings of Aristotle. However, following Strato's death, many of Aristotle's teachings fell by the wayside, and the school fell into anonymity. Aristotle's ideas saw a revival about 200 years later in the quote-unquote late Peripatetics of Andronicus of Rhodes and Boethius of Sidon. Now, finally, we'll move on to the 3 major schools of Hellenistic philosophy. Often, if you're talking about schools of ancient Greek philosophy, these 3 are the big ones. That's Stoicism, Skepticism, and Empiricism. Stoics were so called because of the stoa or columns in the agora that they lectured in. Stoics held that virtue was the only good and vice the only bad, as virtue was the only thing that is good in all circumstances. Stoics shun many, though not all, emotions, as these are based on false judgments about what is good or bad, identifying things other than virtue, such as the desire for wealth, as good, and identifying things other than vice, like fearing heights, as bad. Once again, while certainly very far from the Cynic position, we can see some of the linkages back to the Cynic rejection of artificial values and the Stoic rejection of emotions. Stoicism has many more aspects that we cannot cover in this video, but check out our video on Stoicism for more. Epicureans were named for their leader, Epicurus, who lectured in a school called the Garden. or a house with a very large garden, often referred to as the garden. Like the Cyrenaics, Epicureans argued that pleasure or happiness was the only good. However, unlike the Cyrenaics, the Epicureans had a much more nuanced definition of what constituted pleasure. For Epicureans, pleasure was the relief of pain and the fulfillment of natural desires that can actually be fulfilled. Epicurus offered a range of arguments, including that we should not fear death, and one of the first documented expressions of the problem of evil, as in the problem of evil for the existence of God. Finally, we're saving the best for last. Our final school is the Skeptics. Now, skepticism is a wide school. It's often divided into Pyrrhonian skepticism and academic skepticism. Pyrrho of Elis was the founder of skepticism, but for many years the only school of skepticism was Plato's Academy. Academic skeptics like Arcesilas and Carneades are distinguished from Pyrrhonists because the academics actively assented to the claim that knowledge is impossible. They were saying that you cannot know anything, whereas the Pyrrhonian skeptics like Pyrrho, Timon, Anaximenes, and Sextus Empiricus doubted even this claim was true, rather doubting everything and suspending judgment on everything. I, as a Pyrrhonian skeptic, am particularly interested in these schools, but it's important to note that this kind of division of academic skeptics from Pyrrhonian skeptics doesn't always perfectly track. All of these individual skeptics did have their own views, and they don't always perfectly fall into these buckets. Plato's Academy would eventually evolve into the view of eclecticism espoused by Antiochus, and much later into something we'd refer to as Neoplatonism. The Academy stuck around for quite some time, even after the kind of skeptical periods of it. Check out our video on Pyrrho and the academics for more on ancient skepticism and the differences between these positions. Whew! And with that, those were the 13 schools of ancient Greek philosophy. Stay tuned for upcoming videos on the Peripatetics, the Sophists, hopefully the Megarians, and more. And like I said, we have a playlist with all of the videos we have so far on the ancient schools of Greek philosophy, and we'll be adding these videos to those as well. If you like this content and you want to see more, you want to make sure you don't miss when a video on the Peripatetics or the Sophists comes up, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and of course watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.